Vanderbilt had the power, Rockefeller had the oil, but this man had the fire. Andrew Carnegie, 5'3", the smallest giant in American history. But he didn't start as a titan. He started as a starving rat in the slums. 1848. His family fled Scotland with nothing. They lived in one room. At age 12, Andrew was forced to work. A bobbin boy in a cotton factory. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. His salary, $1.20. He later wrote, "I began to learn what poverty meant." It burned him. But Andrew had a secret weapon, a photographic memory. He clawed his way out, became a telegraph messenger. But he didn't just deliver notes. He memorized the face and name of every businessman in Pittsburgh. He greeted them by name. He charmed them. He made himself impossible to ignore. One man noticed the hustle. Tom Scott, the railroad king of Pennsylvania. Scott hired him as an assistant. He decided to teach the boy the dark arts of business, insider trading, backroom deals, how to rig the system before the game even starts. One day Scott told him, "Buy 10 shares of Adams Express, it's about to pop." Carnegie had zero money, so he went to the only bank that trusted him, his mother. Margaret Carnegie mortgaged their tiny house to give him $500. He bought the stock. He waited. A month later, a white envelope slid under his door. It was a dividend check for $10. He stared at it. He hadn't worked a single hour for it. He screamed, "Here's the goose that lays the golden eggs!" He realized the secret. You don't get rich by working. You get rich by owning. Then the Civil War broke out. The North needed trains to move armies. Carnegie was in charge of the lines, but he saw a fatal problem. The bridges were made of wood and iron. Under heavy loads, they burned or snapped. Iron was too weak. It was brittle. It couldn't hold the weight of the future. Carnegie became obsessed. He needed something stronger, indestructible. He traveled to England and saw a new, terrifying invention. The Bessemer process. Blasting pure oxygen into molten iron. It turned weak iron into steel, the strongest material on Earth. But steel was rare. It was expensive, used for jewelry, not bridges. Carnegie did the math. If he could mass-produce it, he wouldn't just build bridges. He could build skyscrapers. He could build cities. He could build America. He rushed back to New York. He slammed his fist on the table and told his partners, "Sell everything. Iron is dead. The future is steel." In the next episode, you'll see him bet his entire life on a bridge. He bet his entire fortune on a metal that didn't exist yet, to cross a river that couldn't be crossed. 1870. The Mississippi River cut America in half. It was a mile wide and violent. To build a railroad west, you had to cross it. But the Mississippi was a graveyard for bridges. Every engineer said it was impossible. The current was too strong. The bottom was shifting sand. Andrew Carnegie didn't listen. He found a crazy engineer named Captain Eads. Eads had a radical idea. Build the first bridge in history out of steel. Carnegie pushed all his chips to the center. He financed the whole thing. It was suicide. Construction was a nightmare. They had to dig 100 feet underwater to find bedrock. Men started dying. They came up from the deep, screaming in pain. They called it the bends. The nitrogen in their blood was turning into bubbles. Work stalled. The banks panicked. Carnegie ran out of cash. He had to write letters to investors, lying that everything was fine. He was one day away from ruin. Finally, after 4 years of hell, the Eads Bridge was finished. It was the biggest bridge in the world. But it stood empty. People were terrified. They whispered that steel was brittle and would snap like glass. If no one crossed it, Carnegie was destroyed. He needed a stunt. He remembered an old superstition. An elephant will never walk on an unsafe structure. So he hired a circus. He closed the streets of St. Louis. Thousands gathered on the riverbank. Silence fell over the city. Carnegie led the massive beast to the edge of the steel deck. If the elephant turned back, the company died. The audience held their breath. Carnegie watched, sweat dripping down his face, praying. The elephant took a step, then another. It didn't stop. The crowd erupted. They stormed the bridge. Steel was real. Carnegie had proven that steel could hold the weight of the world. Orders flooded in. Every railroad in America wanted to replace their tracks with steel. Carnegie was rich, but he wanted to be the king. He built the biggest steel plant on Earth, the Edgar Thomson Works. He cut prices. He destroyed competitors. He was ruthless. But he had a weakness. He wanted to be loved. He couldn't do the dirty work. He couldn't squeeze the workers himself. He needed a monster, a man with no soul to run the machine. He found him in the coal mines, the king of coke, Henry Clay Frick, the most hated man in America. You'll get to meet the villain of the story in part 3 in the next episode. To the world, he was a saint, a kindly old man giving away millions. But to his workers, he was the devil in a tuxedo. 1890. Andrew Carnegie was the richest man on earth, but he had a fatal flaw. He desperately wanted to be loved. He wrote essays about charity. He told the press, "The man who dies rich dies disgraced." But you don't build an empire by being a saint. You build it by being a killer. Carnegie needed a henchman, someone to do the dirty work so his hands stayed clean. He found him in the coal mines of Pennsylvania, Henry Clay Frick, the king of coke. Frick was a self-made millionaire by 30. He didn't just defeat unions, he crushed them for sport. Carnegie made him a partner. It was a deal with the devil. Together, they created a ruthless machine called vertical integration. They didn't just own the steel mills. They bought the iron mines in Minnesota. They bought the ships to carry the ore. They bought the railroads to haul it. Profits exploded. Carnegie should have been happy, but he was obsessed. He had one rival left, John D. Rockefeller, the man with the oil. They hated each other. Every Christmas they sent cheap, mocking gifts, a cardboard vest, a bottle of sour wine. Carnegie wanted to crush him. He demanded more profit. He needed to squeeze the lemon dry. But the workers at the Homestead plant were breaking. They were starving. They demanded a raise. They threatened to strike. The unions were rising up. Carnegie couldn't be the saint and crush the workers at the same time. So he turned to Frick. He whispered, "Do what you have to do." Then Carnegie did the most cowardly thing in business history. He fled to a luxury castle in Scotland to hide thousands of miles from the violence. He left Henry Frick alone. He unleashed the monster. Frick didn't negotiate. He built a wall, a massive 12-foot barricade around the factory. He installed sniper towers. He added water cannons filled with boiling liquid. The workers looked up at it in horror. They called it Fort Frick. Frick posted a notice. "Wages cut by 22%. Take it or leave it." The workers didn't leave. They seized the plant. They locked the gates. They locked Frick out of his own factory. It was a siege. Frick smiled. This was exactly what he wanted. An excuse for war. He picked up the phone. He didn't call the police. He called an army. The Pinkerton Detective Agency. Mercenaries for hire who had killed for money before. 300 men. Armed with Winchester rifles. Orders to shoot to kill. They were coming up the river on barges. Under the cover of darkness. You will see the bloodiest battle in labor history in the next episode, Part 4. Andrew Carnegie was the Steel King of America. He claimed to be a hero to the working man. But in 1892, the mask fell off. He demanded wage cuts at his Homestead plant, then fled to a castle in Scotland to hide. He left his ruthless partner, Henry Frick, in charge. Frick didn't negotiate. He locked the workers out. Then, Frick did the unthinkable. He hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency, a private army of mercenaries. 300 men with Winchester rifles, floating upriver on barges covered by fog. Their orders: retake the steel mill, shoot anyone who stands in the way. But the town wasn't sleeping. A factory whistle screamed into the night. Thousands rushed to the riverbank, armed with rocks, old muskets, and rage. The Pinkertons landed. A shot rang out. No one knows who fired first. Hell broke loose. 12 hours of open warfare on American soil. The workers dragged an old Civil War cannon up the hill and fired. They missed, so they grabbed sticks of dynamite and threw them like grenades. It wasn't enough. The Pinkertons were dug in, so the workers went nuclear. They poured oil into the river and struck a match. The river caught fire. The barges were trapped in a ring of flames. The mercenaries panicked. They raised the white flag. They surrendered. The workers had won the battle, but they lost the war. The governor sent in the National Guard. He crushed the strike with bayonets. Frick had won. He sat in his office, victorious. But he wasn't safe. An anarchist named Alexander Berkman burst into the room. No appointment. He shot Frick in the neck. Point blank. Then he shot him again. Frick didn't die. He stood up, bleeding, and tackled the assassin. Berkman pulled a knife and stabbed him in the leg. Frick still held him down. When the police arrived, Frick refused to go to the hospital. He refused anesthesia, letting them dig the bullets out while he sat at his desk. He finished his paperwork. He wrote a letter to Carnegie. "This will not fail. I do not think I shall die. But whether I do or not, the company will win. The strike was broken. The union was dead. Carnegie's profits doubled. But the blood was on Carnegie's hands, and he knew it. He spent his life trying to buy his way into heaven. But Frick never apologized. He told Carnegie to go to hell. Tell Mr. Carnegie I'll see him in hell where we both belong." Next, you will see the man who bought the presidency in the final episode of the Carnegie Saga. He became the richest man in history with a scribbled number. But the money didn't save him. It haunted him. 1901. Andrew Carnegie was the king of steel, but his crown was heavy with blood. Memories of the Homestead strike and flooded towns were killing him. He wanted out. He wanted to save his soul. But to do that, he had to sell his empire. There was only one man on earth rich enough to buy him out. J.P. Morgan. They called him Jupiter. He controlled the banks, the railroads, and the government. Morgan wanted a monopoly. He wanted to own the entire steel industry. But Carnegie and Morgan were rivals. They couldn't speak directly. It was a game of egos. They used a middleman, Charles Schwab, Carnegie's charming protege. Schwab cornered Morgan at a dinner. He painted a vision of a super trust. Morgan listened and asked one question. "How much?" Schwab ran to Carnegie. The old man sat at his desk and picked up a pencil. He scribbled a number on a scrap of paper. $480 million. That is $400 billion today. The GDP of a medium-sized country. Schwab took the paper to Wall Street. Morgan glanced at it. He didn't even blink. He said, "I accept." Later, Morgan shook Carnegie's hand and said the famous words, "Congratulations, Mr. Carnegie. You are now the richest man in the world." He had won the game of capitalism, but he felt terrified. He remembered his own rule: the man who dies rich dies disgraced. He spent his last 18 years in a panic. He had to give it away. He shoveled money out faster than he made it. He built 2,509 libraries, one in almost every town in America. He built Carnegie Hall, bought 7,000 church organs. He was buying his way into heaven. He gave away $350 million, 90% of his entire fortune. He tried to buy peace. He built the Peace Palace to stop all wars. But World War I came anyway. It broke his heart. 1919. Carnegie died. He left the world with almost nothing in his pockets. He didn't want his tombstone to mention steel or money. It just says, "Here lies a man who knew how to enlist better men than himself." He was a ruthless tyrant. He was a generous saint. He was both. But the man who bought his company was just getting started. J.P. Morgan didn't want to give money away. He wanted to own the world. He took Carnegie's steel and created the first billion-dollar corporation, U.S. Steel. Subscribe to this channel to follow the saga of J.P. Morgan next. Witness the rise of empires. Rockefeller and Vanderbilt sagas are also available on this channel.